Okay, hi Sahaj. Thanks so much for being here with us. We're really excited to be here with you to talk about your book and talk about your Brown Girl Therapy community. Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so we recently read your book. I have to say, the thing that really caught my eye was the name.
Yeah.
And the name is just so relatable. It's just something, it's just that expression that we've grown up hearing, like, what will people say? And in Pakistan, we would say, log kya kahenge. It's just one of those things that's like echoing in our minds all the time. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the inspo behind the name for you personally?
Yeah, definitely. So as you said, it's very common in South Asian households. And, for me, I experienced my parents saying that to me at a very specific time when I was going through something traumatic, needed therapy. And, to some people, they would read that part of my book in the beginning and say, wow, your parents are so selfish or so, uncaring that they're so worried about what other people will think versus you trying to get the help that you might need. And that's where culture comes in, right? So, I know that my parents were really and seriously concerned about their reputation, about their family name, about them being able to help me. At the time, the conversations we had around me needing mental health care were really difficult and complicated and complex and painful. But now I can say, oh, I think that they thought they failed me in some way because something happened to me that was uncontrollable. None of us could have predicted it. And they didn't know how to handle that because they've lived their whole lives trying to make sure that me and my kids were safe, stable, secure, had all of the opportunities. And so they, when I told them that I was depressed after I told them I went through a traumatic incident, my mom had said, well, what are other people going to think? And that's kind of where the name inspo comes from. But obviously, on a bigger scale, we know that this is a very common saying across the culture, across South Asian communities. And even more when I took to the community in Brown Girl Therapy, which has over 100 countries represented. So it's not just South Asian. A lot of people were telling me, oh, this is a really common saying in our household too. And I'm Hispanic, or, I come from a different part of the world. I'm not South Asian. And I heard this all the time growing up. So I really wanted to touch on the nuance of how so many of us are raised, especially in the West, with this understanding that we're supposed to care about what other people think. And as you see in the book, I'm looking at it right now, but as you see in the book, the cover has two different colors in the faces and the background behind the name. And a part of that for me was that I didn't just feel like growing up that I was worried about what other people were going to think in my Indian community or in my Punjabi community or in my South Asian community. I also worried what people were going to think about me in my American community. So for me, being bicultural, I was always concerned about whether or not I was enough in all of the spaces I occupied. So I really wanted that to come through in the cover where we decided to change the faces to two different colors. That way it felt like there were two different communities kind of watching you, which is just really poignant for how I kind of lived my life.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for you, actually, the title comes from a really deep place of trauma.
Yeah, I think so. I think trauma, but also trying to figure out what healing looks like for me. And that included caring what other people think. Whereas in the Western world, we're told to not care what other people think. And so trauma, yes, culture, yes, and healing, yes.
And I guess from your parents' perspective at the time, like, what will people say is also a way of protecting you, which is the
Mhm.
other aspect that you bring into the book, like the parents' perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing is I didn't have the language then to have those kinds of conversations with them, but I have it now. And that's like that's the through line through my work at Brown Girl Therapy and also as a clinician living in the West, working with immigrants and children of immigrants, is to help people understand um, our loved ones' perspectives, their frame of references, their cultural connotations for saying things, not saying things, for doing things, not doing things, while also being true to ourselves and figuring out what our values are and where they overlap and might differ with those loved ones to help us kind of maintain those relationships that are important to us without foregoing our own sense of self.
Yes, Sahaj, that was actually one of my questions on how you talk about this and how we can be true to our authentic selves while being in a collectivist culture. However, how do you, how I wonder how would that look like for parents who are, or, you know, even families, extended families, which are very rigid and they don't have that much space available for your true selves to come out and be authentic. Yeah.
Are you asking for the children who want to do that,
Yeah.
or just in
Yes.
general one?
Just,
Yeah.
just children who want to do that, who want to
Yeah.
connect, and they
I
have
mean,
to.
yeah, it's very complicated. And a lot of my clients come from those rigid families where they're the first ones. A lot of my clients are first-time therapy goers. I'm their first therapist ever. They're terrified to talk poorly about their family. They, you know, are worried that I'm going to judge their family. I mean, a lot of the work we do before we even talk about their values and their family experiences is for them to even get comfortable and for me to make that space for them to even share all of their conflicting, you know, mixed emotions that they have about everything. And I think that for a lot of children who grow up in rigid families, that's the work first, is being able to address that you did grow up in a rigid environment. And so how has that been impacting the ways that you are allowing yourself to even feel your own emotions? A lot of times the answer is not at all, that you have swallowed your emotions, that you've suppressed them, that you've rationalized them, that you've ignored them in some way. And I think that that's part of the work, is figuring out how to make space for yourself, for yourself. So in a rigid family where maybe having these conversations or voicing your opinions doesn't feel safe or doesn't feel good or doesn't feel like it's going to go anywhere, a lot of times I will have my clients or work with people in the community and say, how can you make the space for yourself? Is it in a single friendship where you feel safe to talk about this? Is it finding that professional care? Is it being a part of these online communities where you feel like you can see other people struggling with the same thing as you, and you're allowed to start making room for what you're feeling? Because oftentimes it's really hard to have these conversations with other people, let alone our parents or our elders who we want to seek approval and belonging with. But we can't have those conversations with other people if we can't have those conversations with ourselves, right? The way the saying goes is you can only go as deep with other people as you can go with yourself. That rings really true in these kinds of families where really it's about carving out room for yourself, maybe outside of the family, to grow before you can come back into the family and say, hey, I'm ready to have these conversations. Because a lot of this work is not about changing other people. It's about, what's the intention of saying something? Is it for you? Is it because you're seeking something in response? So really getting clear with yourself about why you would even want to approach these conversations. Because I mean, in all honesty, a lot of the work I do with clients is accepting that our parents or our elders may not change, that those rigid environments that you live in are actually going to stay rigid. So what does it mean for you to take care of yourself and look after yourself? What does it mean for you to maintain these relationships if they're important to you and that's what you want to do, while you also take care of your wellness and your mental health? And those are really, really big questions, right? I don't have the answers. It's work that we have to do together. And I always want to remind people that they have agency, they have autonomy to decide for themselves what the answer is. And that's a part of my book, is when I do my book talks and I've been traveling on book tour, so many people ask me, are you going to give me the answers to these questions? Are you going to tell me, like, here's what you need to do in order to make things better in my family? And no, I'm not. I'm going to hold up a mirror. I'm going to give you more questions rather than answers. And then you're going to actually have to figure out what those answers are for yourself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because we also, even while reading the book, and there was so much, it was very, very relatable, even though we're living in, you know, in South Asia. It is still a very collectivist culture. You know, the family systems are very rigid. It is hard to have these very difficult conversations with our parents. And yeah, you're right. In a way, it is more about reflecting on what's coming up for you, and why in these environments.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it, Sahaj. We're more
I was just
interested.
yeah. I was just gonna say that, you know, when I look, so Instagram lets you see like the top 5 countries that your audience lives in, and India is actually number 4. And so people are often surprised by that, because they're like, well, they're not children of immigrants. They're still living in that culture, in that country. And, you know, there's a lot of generational differences that are often mimicking cultural differences, right? If we think about the way the media has come through, or the access to technology and social media now for this generation, it looks very different for them to be growing up. You know, even when I watch Bollywood movies now, I'm shocked to see that they're kissing. I'm like, oh my God, when I was growing up,
There was a
25,
flower. A flower would
yeah,
come
it
in the
was
middle.
like, you were like playing with each other. There was like
Yeah,
there
yeah,
was no touch. And
yeah.
that was the like media and the narratives that I grew up with. And I know for immigrants who move to the West from South Asia, they often are also holding true to values and norms that were accepted and around when they left the country. So even though, for instance, my parents left India in the 80s, I grew up with them holding true to those 80s Indian norms, even though India might have evolved in some way, because for them, that was what they last knew about their country, their culture. And so it's really interesting because every family, no matter where you live, right? If you're in South Asia, if you're across the world in Australia, the community has a big New Zealand, Australia population. If you're in Europe, even if you're European children of immigrants, there are so many people who are like, oh, these generational things ring true, even though we don't share the same race, even though I live in a different country. And so I think that's really interesting.
And that's a conversation that me and Sam were having throughout while we were reading the book. We're like, okay, so for Sahaj, this is an immigrant experience, but this is exactly the South Asian experience for us, from everything, like from the guilt to the shame to the collectivism, like so many things. But so Sahaj, for you, being from the family that you're from and then also living in the West, is there, in terms of community, like a happy medium? Because there's so many struggles that we see in individualistic societies as well. And then, the kind of struggles that you talk about in your book about collectivist societies, what role do you see community playing in a healthy way?
Community is so important. I mean, I single-handedly have been able to observe and witness and experience the power of community. I think for so many people in immigrant communities, in non-Western, non-white communities, community is so important, right? Because we are taught to be interconnected with one another. And I think that's the power of community for so many of us is, yes, on one hand of the coin, it might mean looking at what other people are going to think or say about your actions, behaviors, choices, and that can feel really paralyzing for a lot of people. But on the other side, it's also knowing, oh, I have this community I'm a part of. How do I root into it? How do I have pride in being a part of this community? How do I have pride in being a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a parent, right? Those are roles that are so important to so many of us who grow up in really insular communities. I think specifically in the West, because I can speak to, the Western research and being a child of immigrants, in the West, they talk about how, and they meaning like mainstream wellness conversations talk about how enmeshment is not a good thing. And I really struggle with that because enmeshment actually is an adaptive and protective factor for insular communities, immigrant communities that want to protect themselves from harm from the dominant society. And I think that theme translates no matter where you live. It's about, okay, we're claiming each other as our own. We're going to protect each other like our family. We want to make sure that we're safe. We want to make sure that we're secure. I would see my parents, taking care of other community members. Just, there was no transaction. It was like, you need something, I'm here to take care of you. We're in this together. And I think that's the power of community, is knowing that you don't have to go it alone. So many people in the West, especially, struggle with feeling like they have to get help by themselves, that they have to know the answers themselves, that they have to figure it out alone. And that's where I feel like community is so important. We don't know how to heal. We should not have to heal by ourselves. I just don't think that that's how healing works. I think we heal in connection with other people. And I think if we're not concerned about connecting with other people, then we're also foregoing, growth, like collective liberation. It's almost like a selfish act of only focusing on yourself. And so I think community can be really powerful because it does allow people to feel like they have people to lean on, especially when it comes to seeking care, right? I mean, the research in the West says that people in immigrant communities are more likely to seek out care from someone within the community, whether that's a religious person in power, whether that's a leader in the community. They're often more likely to go to a mental health care professional or a doctor who looks like them, who speaks their language, who shares in their culture. That's where community can help us kind of demystify mental health care, professional care. What does it mean to get help when we have more people who look like us who are able to offer those services?
And there's also like these studies coming out now in like Western research about like the longevity or happiness of life is so linked to community, right?
Absolutely. Like the intergenerational narratives, the idea that we can connect with our elders, that we can share stories, those help us live longer because it also helps us root into our identity. Just knowing more about your people, about your ancestry, about your elders, just, even play, right? Just engaging in community play, in community activity is so good for your mental health. All of these things are just about remembering that we are interconnected and we never have to do life alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think like the universality in South Asian or I think collectivist societies in your book, like would you like to, one thing that really stood out because like as therapists in Pakistan, so much of our work is around deconstructing guilt and shame.
Yeah.
And I know like there's an angle where it's like an immigrant experience, but if we look at it more like a cultural experience, what would you say factors into why guilt is such a dominant theme in South Asian family systems?
I think that's the other side of community for so many of us. I think that there's a lot of guilt that we are not playing those roles that are important to us as well as we should be because of expectations placed on us. I think gender is a big part of it. There's a lot of traditional gendered expectations in immigrant community, South Asian community. So there's these expectations of how you're supposed to show up as a woman, how you're supposed to show up as a man, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to show respect. And I think the minute that we as individuals step out of line from the expectations imposed on us, we will feel guilt because we feel like we are doing something wrong, that we are letting our family down, that we are betraying our community, that we are not acting within our cultural identity in the right way. And I think that that's where guilt differs in collectivist cultures than individualistic culture. Obviously, the feeling is the same, but I think it arises so much more in collectivist cultures because we are motivated by group harmony, by making sure that we keep the peace, by making sure that we are connecting with one another. So we have so many more opportunities to feel guilt because there are so many more opportunities for us to do something that goes outside of those expectations of community.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But while talking about expectations, that something that really stood out for me was the expectation of exceptionalism and how dominant that is in South Asian cultures. And it really puts like, it parents, they're willing to accept only certain different life paths along the way if you're exceptional at them. While, otherwise it's very rigid in how much of a leeway they have for their children to pursue whatever they want. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even historically, right, before it was known as exceptionalism for our children or for children, it was classism, it was casteism, it was maintaining like a hierarchy of who deserves what, who's better than who. And so that narrative is just passed down, and especially in generations in the West, where we add to this exceptionalism that we bring with us from South Asia is also the model minority myth or the stereotypes in the West about South Asians and how we are supposed to, like what we're good at, right? I have like this kind of anecdote where I was working a marketing job at like an art firm. And I was in the office and someone asked me if I worked in tech. And it was it was just an ask. But for me, I was like, oh, the entire tech team at this firm is South Asian. Therefore, there are assumptions that because I look a certain way or I identify a certain way, I must be good at science, I must be good at technology. That must be what I do. So that's a very oversimplified example, but those are, the stereotypes that exist in the West that perpetuate these ideas that we should be exceptional. And as you read in my book, I failed school. I didn't do well academically for a long time. I struggled for a long time. And a part of my struggle was that I didn't know how to get help. I think I was also emotionally really immature at the time that I was struggling, but I think it was also these narratives that it was expected of me to succeed. There was no question. It wasn't maybe you won't do well, maybe you'll make a mistake, maybe you'll need help. It was you're going to go to college, you're going to do really well, you're going to get a job. And that was it. So it was so rigid. There was a lot of rigidity in those expectations that can also feel really suffocating for a lot of people who kind of step outside of that path, either by choice because they want to do something different or because they're actually struggling and they just don't fit that kind of stereotype placed on us.
Yeah, and there was so much joy for me towards the end of the book as like Sam came into the book and at this point where not to be a typical South Asian, like, oh, there's a boy in the picture,
Yeah,
but
I get it.
very and also the way that you spoke about going back to your degree. And it really makes the book, and I suppose it really speaks to your life, like coming full circle, where you are actively engaging in evaporating that shame just by speaking about it. And now it's published in a book. And I thought that was really beautiful, the way you really demonstrated that through your life, not just in your content.
Yeah, I mean, that was honestly, the book took 3 years, 5 drafts, it took a long time. And a part of why it took a long time was because I was really actively working through a lot of my own shame while writing this book. And I had editors who, in the first drafts, when I was writing about school, were like, you're being so mean to yourself in these chapters. Like, this cannot be published like this. You're obviously working through this. Like, we need to like keep editing how you're writing about this. It was really hard for me because, as we talked about, I was expected to be exceptional. I was expected to be on a path. My older brother is a doctor and a lawyer. Like, it was just expected. Just do all the things, be really good at them, don't struggle. And I've carried that shame for a really long time. I mean, we're almost 15 years away from that time in my life, and I still sometimes am like, oh, right, I dropped out of college. I didn't do well. But the part of writing this book was also owning that doesn't mean that's not a moral failure on my part. I want people who read the book to know I chose to share those parts of my story in the book, because for me, I think sharing those parts of my story are also showing everyone else that we shouldn't feel shame about this. If I decided to hide that part of my story in writing this book, I would have been perpetuating the exact shameful narratives that we have in our community by saying, I'm not going to share this because I feel shame, but you all should deal with your shame. That's not how I wanted to show up in the book. And so I think the whole point of the book was really, eviscerating that shame, as you say. And I think the takeaway for me is that we can engage in our purpose at any point in our life, right? For me, it wasn't right out of high school, going to college, figuring out what I wanted to do and doing it. My path was not linear. A lot of our paths aren't linear. It took a lot of like different choices, different mistakes, different experiences before I got to a point and said, oh, I want to be a therapist. And the only way for me to be a therapist is if I have a bachelor's degree, because then that's the only way to go to graduate school. And I think that was the right time for me to re-engage with my education and do it from a place of happiness and purpose and passion rather than just expectation. And I don't know that anyone would have known this about my story if I didn't decide to share it publicly, right? Looking at my life now, no one would have assumed, oh, you must have failed school. And I get messages like that all the time because I've built this community, which, by the way, I'm not special to have built it. I just happened to build something and I'm the person who's facilitating it. I don't think there's anything that makes me more special than the next person. But I get lots of messages from people in the community saying, well, you have it all figured out. You've lived your life so well. Like, you have it all figured out. You must have all the answers. When in reality, me getting to some of my answers was living through some hardship and making mistakes and living through shame and guilt and trying to figure it out for myself and actively trying to do the work. And that's what I really wanted to model in the book was it's not a linear one size fits all path for any of us.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
so important for like especially the younger generations who will be reading your book, to model that it's not a linear process, especially in the South Asian community, because for us it is such a linear process. Like, we're raised to know that it's a linear process as we go through life. So one of the things also that actually Sam and I were discussing this because we both really related to this. At some point in the book, you talk about how you don't trust your own narrative in some context. And I was like, oh, this is so relatable for me. And
After
Sam was,
one.
Yeah, it's the same. You're just questioning of what was and what is. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I was noticing and I was curious, like in your book, it's so remarkable, like what you've done through your community. Like you're able to have taken these polls and, you know, you have all this research in what I understand is a largely super unresearched demographic, right? So that's great. But every time I was reading, like anything you would say, you would almost always back it by the research. And it's something that I can relate to because, you know, when I'm speaking about a topic, I will try to back it, or I will say, you know, I read it here, or someone told me. And I'm always amazed by people who just speak from a place of just knowing as if it's just their knowing.
Yeah.
And that's something I noticed because that's something I don't do. And so I felt like, did it feel important, or did you feel compelled to back up your voice as a Brown therapist in the book by referencing so much research?
So it's an interesting question because that part of chapter 1 didn't exist until the very end of book writing. And a part of that was because I had realized through book writing that I kept questioning myself. Did this actually happen? Is this valid? How should I write about this? Do I need to back this up? Is my story important enough? Will people care if it's just my story and not research? I kept asking myself all these questions throughout the entire book writing process. And it wasn't until like draft 4 that I decided to even add chapter 1 as chapter 1, which was our stories matter as they are. We do not have to prove them, legitimize them in any way, back them up. And a part of that, especially in the Western world and just systematically in the world, is that we as marginalized communities are taught to feel like our stories don't matter. You know, we are taught to feel like, well, you know, don't take up too much space, don't rock the boat, be grateful for what you have. And those narratives can then be internalized as, I should just keep my mouth shut. I should trust what other people have to say, especially in a hierarchical, collectivist culture. I need to just trust what my elder is telling me. I'm not going to fight back. You know, that's disrespectful if I do that. I don't want to be rude. So we start to learn to kind of chip away at our own inner voice and not listen to it as much. And I think that's what happens. That's why we feel the need to legitimize what we feel and experience. And so much of my work in the community, in my community programs and workshops, and with my work with my clients, is just giving space to people to own their voice, to just say the thing that they're feeling. It's okay if you want to change your mind. It's okay if you feel differently in 6 days, 6 months, 6 years, but I just want you to practice saying it right now. I feel this, right? That can be so hard for so many of us. And I think that's because we are made to feel like our feelings are not enough, that we don't matter as we are. And to go to your point professionally, I feel the same way. You know, a lot of the research is very much created by and normed for white people. And there's more research now, and there's so many more people doing the research now, but that research is still being done, that it doesn't exist quite yet. And so I tried really hard to find the international or the more culturally appropriate research where I could. And it felt important to me to share that, just to say, hey, there is some research on our communities. But in other places, like you said, I had to turn to polls, which a lot of people, not a lot, I get some messages from people being like, this isn't science. And I'm like, I know it's not science, but when I have 200,000 people at my fingertips and I can get 6,000 to 10,000 people responding to a poll, and then evidence-based research in the West has 6 people participating in a research study, I'm going to turn to these polls and say, yes, this is not empirical by any means. I say that in the introduction, but this is still really valid and valuable. I don't want to gatekeep our stories just because I'm the facilitator or the writer or the leader. And that was so important to me, was to recognize that, yes, this is not empirical based research, but 7,000 people feel the same way, or 6,000 people also said this. And that just feels really important for people like us who are reading this book and can say, oh, I relate to your story, but oh my gosh, so do 6,000 other people. Like, that feels so validating to know that you're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was very interesting for me was, you also talk about how most of, the work is done by Western therapists or Western psychologists. All of that is something that we as therapists kind of use in our work, but it's not entirely applicable. The individualist culture cannot really understand that you can't remove the person from their from their community, which is how it's driven by. Yeah? It's driven by removing the person. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Yeah, so much of my work professionally is also training other, like my colleagues and other therapists in the West to work with our community. Because as you said, you can't just, it's not a one size fits all. We're trained in a
Yeah.
certain way to, posit that individuation and individualism is the goal, that we need to like self-actualize to the point of individualism, which is not how so many of us view healing or connection or growth or identity. And, to your point also, I mean, I am curious because I don't know what training is like in South Asia or in other parts of the world, but in the West, it is very individualistic. Whereas I'm also very aware that that's Western therapy, but therapy in the grand sense of it has existed for centuries in so many of our cultures in so many different ways. And so that's another part of my work when I work with clients is what are other healing practices that are important to you that might not just be talk therapy?
Mm.
How do we lean into those for you to be well? Because we will talk about the stuff, but talk therapy is not the end all be all. For so many of us, it's somatic work, it's connecting to our roots, it's, Ayurvedic medicine, it's all of these things that we've been taught or that are part of our lineage, that are part of healing beyond just let's talk about you becoming an individual, because that's not enough for so many of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like myself, and I'll speak for Sam, like we've been trained under Western models, as most of the therapists have, like let's say in Pakistan, in Lahore, where we're working. And it's really been like a community movement of therapists constantly getting together, peer supervisions, localized trainings, trying to translate that work that just hasn't existed in our trainings, in the books we read, in the research, to have it fit, even if it's in the realm of talk therapy, but to have it feel right,
Yeah.
because it doesn't necessarily feel right in the way that you train, and then when you deliver it, it just sometimes feels like jarringly like there's a big gap there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's so interesting to me. I mean, I'm not surprised because of colonization, but it's so interesting to me that like even in South Asia that you're still like kind of needing to challenge these models. And it's just so sad to me. I mean, we're all up against, bigger mountains that we're just trying to figure out how to help clients understand that there are more than one ways to heal and more than one ways. And that's why it has to come from within, right? I mean, sometimes people ask me, isn't it tiring to feel like you're always challenging the system? And I'm like, yes, it's exhausting, but I'm not the only one doing it. There's so many of us. And again, that's where community comes in. When we can find a community of other professionals doing this work, it fuels you to have a little more hope to say, it's not just up to me to fix this, like we're going to do this together. And I don't know, I just feel like it's really beautiful to see how people are doing this work, right? I know that I'm doing it in a specific way. I believe in the power of community and advocacy, and that's my work, but there are other people doing it in other ways. And I think it's really amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And, when you were talking about this, how it's, when you talk about in the book that the reflections that you gave out, that was incredibly helpful. And I think we can really use that as part of our work to not only for ourselves, but for our clients, because it's just picking up on what questions can possibly be asked for your own narrative to come up, for your own stories to come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been a really great side effect. I mean, obviously, I wrote this for other children of immigrants, anyone straddling multiple cultures, for the South Asian community. But I've been getting lots of messages from like healthcare and mental health professionals being like, wow, this has helped me connect with my client, or my client sent me this book and now we're reading it together, or you've given me framework for being able to tackle boundaries in a Indian household or whatever. And I think it's really great. Yeah. I'm hoping that it can start these conversations. This is by no means the end of a conversation. It's just the beginning.
Yeah.
And Sahaj, like another huge way that you kind of practice what you preach is actually the publishing of this book, right? So I know you've spoken about the challenges a little bit, like with how your parents felt about you writing it, and then you actually going ahead with the writing of it. Can you speak a little bit about what that process was like, how you got from there to where you are now?
Yes, sure. This is a big question I get from a lot of people is, well, how did you write this book? What do your parents think? How do you share your story without foregoing these relationships because you might be, quote unquote, inflicting shame onto your family name by talking openly about some of these issues. And I will say, first and foremost, this is years. It took me years to get to the point to write this book. It's not like I woke up, said I want to write a book, and then all of a sudden shared everything about my life, and that was it. And I think people need to understand that, like, when you want to share your story, start small. You don't have to wake up tomorrow and share your whole story in full, right? Start with people you feel safe with. Start in small ways. If that's something that you're interested in, you can start in ways that feel good to you rather than saying, let me share everything. Like, I knew for me that talking about my college experience was going to be the last thing I got comfortable sharing, because it was something I was working up towards. In terms of how I talk about my family, right, it was really important to me. Again, no one told me, my editors weren't like, we need more of your family. I chose to share those things. And I think for me, I have to practice what I preach. I believe in the value of storytelling, as a way to heal, as a way to connect. And I think for so many of us, like we talked about, where research doesn't exist and we feel so isolated from these wellness like tips and advice and norms, I knew that I wanted this book to be a resource for so many people. And that meant having to show up really authentically and openly. I've had a lot of hard conversations with my parents over the course of writing this book. And I'll be honest, my dad really surprised me. At the very beginning, he said, write what you have to write. I trust you, which was really liberating and really, I know, unusual for like a stoic immigrant dad to say that. My mom, on the other hand, was like very hesitant and very scared. There was a lot of, this is my life. You can write about you, but don't talk about me at all. Don't talk about my private life. I don't want to be in your book. And I was like, well, that's not possible. You're going to be in this book, but let's talk about what and why. And so over the course of those 3 years of writing my book, I took probably the first third to just write what I needed to write, work with my editors, not tell my family anything about what was going in the book, because I needed to decide what I even thought needed to go in the book. That helped me, understand the framework for my book, understand I didn't share everything about my family, like what are things that actually need to be in here versus what are things that aren't that important and I can like protect my family around. And then as we got closer to publication, I did start reading quote unquote the worst parts of the book to my parents. So like chapter 1, where I talk about what was normal to me growing up. I know that was a part that my parents might feel bad having reflected back to them. And so I did sit them down and say, hey, I want to read a few passages to you that I think need to be in the book. Let's talk about it. And, my mom cried and my dad was silent. And my dad was like, you're not lying about anything. Like, you're not lying. And it's hard for me to accept that this is going to be out in the world. And my mom was more concerned, like, what are people going to think? Which is so ironic, right? Because that's the whole point of this book. And so we had to have lots of hard conversations. And ultimately, my parents decided that they were not going to read the book. I think that might change, but they weren't going to read the book, that they trusted me, and that at the end of the day, they trusted that my why for writing the stuff came from the right place. And that's what I always tell people. You don't write from the wound, you write from the scar. So if you're in the middle of healing, if you're in the middle of that anger, if you're in the middle of those really deep, complicated emotions, your writing is going to look so different from when you are from a more healed part of yourself. If I wrote this book even 5-10 years ago, it would have been a totally different book, because that was in the middle of my therapy journey, in the middle of being like really mad at my family, in the middle of me still working through all my emotions. It would have come out as a different type of book. Whereas now I feel like I was able to write from a place of love and compassion and honesty without it feeling like I'm just writing this book to talk trash about my family. And I think that's the difference there, is that we have to be honest about our why. And at the end of the day, my moral compass was that I talked to my parents about everything that was in the book at some point in my life. There's nothing in this book that they would read and say, I didn't know that, or you never even tried to talk to me about that. Like, I did my due diligence to always try to have conversations with my family. And so I know for me that I tried to talk to my family about all of this stuff, whether or not they agree, whether or not they understood, whether or not they wanted to engage. They will not be surprised by anything that's in this book.
Wow. So it sounds like a really powerful healing journey just at the micro level within your family through the production of this book.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I sat on the phone with my sister for hours when she would read the book and see herself reflected back. And we would talk about how we had different experiences of a certain thing, or she didn't remember it that way. And it honestly brought us closer because we were able to say, yeah, it was what we were just talking about. We were able to say, your perspective is valid. There's not just one truth. And my sister was able to say, but if this is how you remember it and this is how you experienced it, you need to write it this way. And that's just really powerful to be able to have these conversations and say, we can respect each other's experiences and perspectives of our past while also not trying to make it so you feel exactly the same way I feel, right? And I think that's the difference between a rigid family structure, which is you need to feel the way I feel and you need to stay within these confines in order for us to be loved and respected, versus a flexible family dynamic, which is, okay, we can allow kind of some flexibility on people being different, having different perspectives, having different feelings. And it's really hard because in a lot of collectivist families, the former, the rigidity is more common.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's really common. It's a whole spectrum, right? But it's really, I think, beautiful to see like the evolution that your family goes through to the point where you can describe that, how they trust you to publish whatever you need to, and then you also accept that they might not read the book. Like there's just so much acceptance in this whole space at this point. But okay, so I know we're almost out of time. Thank you so much for this, Sahaj.
Yeah.
This was so insightful.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Sahaj. This was wonderful.
Of course, it was so nice to be in conversation.